Well, thanks very much, Frederick, and thanks very much for having me here. It's great to be here. Okay, well, let's have a look at the basically economic benefits of air transport. And I won't be talking about other aspects, but of course you can, you would be, I guess, aware of those. So, first of all, I'll have a look at some of the issues that I'll just discuss briefly today. I asked the question of what are the economic impacts, costs and benefits of aviation. I looked at the questions about whether economies gain or lose from imposing measures which lessen emissions, such as various taxes and so on, and the impacts on, say, GDP or national income, but also the net benefits. And I'll be also looking at some comparing results from some studies and some suggestions. Okay, now just looking at the benefits, mainly the economic benefits, how would we look at them? Well, there are costs and benefits to the direct suppliers and users. And so people who travel get benefit from aviation, and the airlines that supply, and airports that supply, also get a benefit in terms of profits, probably. So those are some of the benefits. Then on top of that, there are tax benefits to the economy. It might be that the aviation is being bringing in tax benefits. It also might be that there are subsidies which have a cost to the community. Then there are various externalities. In particular, there are negative externalities which are, well, the classic example in our case now is greenhouse and other emissions. And they are an externality. How big they are, we're not going to be talking about specifically today, but we should remember that they could be very substantial. Then there are positive externalities. And these are various aspects of aviation that have been less studied. Now, a lot of people have been argued that there are wider economic benefits other than the direct benefits to the various parties, such as the airlines and the travellers. And so they say that these are wider economic benefits, and they're related to greater connectivity between, say, cities and so forth. And these days there's a recognition of these benefits, but there's an enormous amount of debate about how big they are. Are they very small or are they very large? And I'll come back to some of these issues in a moment. And so one sort of thing that you might sort of think about is, what about aviation taxes? Is aviation being overly taxed or maybe undertaxed? So when you think about it, well, say thinking about Europe perhaps, there's very little VAT, there's little by way of fuel taxes. On the other hand, there are some ticket taxes for the UK and Germany, and of course aviation is part of the EU ETS, though not for extra-European flights. We might end up discussing some of that in a moment. So this, of course, discourages flights and discourages emissions. So there's some, shall we say, taxation of aviation in most of the world, but people would say that it's not linear enough to both to have a big impact on emissions or to make a lot of money for the Treasury. So we think about the taxes as having something to do with raising revenue for the community, and also correcting externalities, but of course you might have to have some subsidies to encourage wider economic benefits, better connectivity and so on. And so last week the Netherlands government held a conference, which I went to, which was all about aviation taxes and of course ETSs and so forth. And so this is an issue which is on the agenda, as it were. Okay, well, going further, I'll just talk a little bit about the ideas that economists tend to use, but sometimes people get a bit confused about. People sometimes talk about the impacts of things, policies, like an aviation tax. Now, impacts are a general term, and so you talk about the impacts on GDP, or jobs, or exports, other taxes, and so on. And then there's a rather more specialised idea of talking about costs and benefits to various people. And so people would talk about how much better off is the economy as a result of having some policies, such as like an aviation tax. And so this is really a matter of cost-benefit analysis. And so what you see in the way that economists have been modelling these questions, you can have models which can go across the whole gamut of aspects, impacts. So it might be you have a model which is able to predict or forecast, let's say, an effect on GDP and jobs, but it might also be able to say, well, could be that the economy could gain by having this tax, or might be it might lose. And you can get models which can do all of those things. And it can do rather more, and I'll point out in a minute. So I guess there's two sorts of problems that we're interested in here. We're interested in how much big or smaller the economy is as a result of some of these policies. And then there's a very more specific aspect of, does the country gain or lose? We need to be able to have a look at that, all of those. Okay, well, I'll just talk a little bit about impact models. There are a large number of studies that you may come across using what's called an economic impact analysis approach, using an input-output approach. Now, some of you may be familiar with this, some of you not. It doesn't really matter. By and large, economists have been moving away from these types of models. These sorts of models tend to exaggerate various effects because they leave out lots of important aspects. And so there's another sort of model called the computable general equilibrium model, which is a more complicated model, but nonetheless it can capture a whole range of effects, and I'll give you an example in a minute. And so certainly people like myself would say this is the better sort of approach. I'm very, rather sceptical of a lot of the input-output type models, that they just pretend to say something, but really there are too many gaps in the analysis. And so these days people would argue that a good way of looking at benefits and costs and impacts of a policy such as an aviation tax or extending an ETS, etc., etc., that's a good way would be using the CGE model. So let's have a look at CGE models. They would be able to do a number of things. First of all, they might be able to have a look at, well, first of all, they look at things taking place over time. And so there might be a temporary rise in unemployment, for example, as the economy adjusts to a new situation. So there's more tax on aviation, but other things have not kept up. Trains have not expanded very much just yet. Okay. There can also be questions about secular unemployment. In other words, a tax might depress the economy, GDP, and jobs. Now that's a very questionable issue. We can talk about it. I don't have the right answer, but I must admit, I don't think that a lot of the sorts of policies that people think about in terms of aviation, emissions and so on would have a big effect on unemployment. But I'll mention a few things. There are various other things that, the type of approach can be used to look at particular sectors, such as tourism industry. Clearly, tourism industry will be very much affected by aviation taxes in both directions, because people may not travel as much to this country, but it also may encourage people to stay at home. So there are two ways there. Then you can also use these sorts of models nowadays to have a look at emissions, various types of emissions, particularly carbon emissions, and say, well, okay, as a result of having this particular policy, which taxes aviation but encourages, let's say, rail, what's the net effect in terms of reduction in emissions? You can do this sort of analysis. Another thing you can do is you can have a look at these wider economic benefits of aviation. And that's a bit more questionable at this stage in terms of development. Okay, so you could have various empirical studies, or shall we say simulation studies, of aviation tax effects. And so I'll just go through a few of these just to sort of give you an idea of what can or can't be done and where the problems are. You can study an aviation tax, but you can also study, let's say, an ETS or a biofuel subsidy, and so on and so forth, a whole range of possibilities. Now, I've mentioned that I don't think that these economic impact analysis studies really capture things very well. Most of them predict the end of the world if there's an aviation tax. I think of things that are a bit more complicated than that. However, there have been a few studies, not so many yet, of computable general equilibrium modelling approaches, the more general type of approach. One was done by myself and my colleagues, 2011 and 14, and another, that was actually done for a tourism department in Australia, and then another was done by a consultant, PwC, in the UK for a group of airlines. And the Australian study actually estimated that, taking everything into account, Australia gained from this particular policy, whereas the UK study estimated that the UK would lose. Okay, well, who's right, who's wrong? Well, it may not be that there's a definite right or wrong answer, but we can have a look at why things are going on. So, let's have a look at the Australian study and the UK study and think about unemployment. Now, the Australian study more or less assumed that there wouldn't be substantial long-run effects on unemployment. You don't lose a lot of jobs, as it were, by having these types of policies. Now that, of course, was a situation where Australia was in a mining boom, but even since then, there hasn't been a lot of serious unemployment. So you really wonder how many jobs would be created or lost by these sorts of policies. On the other hand, the UK study argued that there would be very big effects on unemployment. Lots of jobs would be lost by having an aviation tax. And I'm not quite sure how they really got that sort of result. So I think they've got a very, well, one can discuss that. Second aspect might be these wider economic benefits. Now, in our study, we didn't assume any wider economic benefits at all. Maybe we should have. But the UK study assumed very big wider economic benefits from aviation. And that meant that if you're going to be taxing it, you lose these benefits. So I think those are the main reasons why our study and the UK study differ. There are other reasons. Both recognise the effects on tourism, but that make a big difference. And then, of course, there's a tax export effect, which the Australian study definitely measured. And that was the effect that, say, if you've got a tax and it's paid by some other country, you can gain. So that the UK imposes a tax on everyone who's leaving the UK. A lot of them are Americans or Australians or whoever. And so, in a sense, the British government was essentially able to get other people from other countries to pay their tax. Okay. So, just to sort of finish off then, what I'm trying to do is sort of have a look at some of the net impacts and benefits of aviation and the costs of the various policies that might constrain aviation. And what I've argued is that there are models and models, but you can get models which I would argue would be very pretty accurate in being able to measure a whole range of aspects and also be able to measure the benefits and costs of these policies to the government or the various parts of the economy. And with these sorts of models, you can work out what's really driving things. Now, I think that's one of the important things about modelling, that you don't just simply say, well, okay, we've put these assumptions in, bang, this is the answer, take it away. But rather, it's important, I think, as analysts, to be able to say, well, okay, here is a model, and you can tweak it this way or that way, and you can show, aha, this one's very, you'll find that, let's say, unemployment will be a big effect if something or other happens. Or it could be that tourism makes a big difference, or whatever it might be. And so you can actually use the model to explore questions. And so you think, well, okay, what happens if we brought in some new policy? Would that be giving greater benefits from aviation? Would there be problems in terms of creating too many emissions or too less, with reductions in emissions, etc.? Look at these sorts of things, using the modelling as a tool for exploring the policy questions. So, thank you very much.